Hello, everyone. My name is Julian. I'm an engineer with IC Consult, and I just want to say good morning and welcome to the presentation. Uh, this presentation will be covering, it's titled Solving the Uniqueness Challenge, but it will be going through the IDN Rule tool that was mentioned in the previous presentation. So without further ado, go ahead and jump in there. So for the presentation, like I mentioned, the IDN Rule tool, we're going to discuss how it's utilized, what it is, commonly used methods, take some time for questions there. And then also I wanted to detail a rule development process that we've leveraged at IC Consult, at least in a couple of engagements, just give you, some ideas as far as how to go about implementing some rules. As said in the previous presentation, there is some skill needed with some Java skills needed as far as creating cloud-based rules, as well as working the process with expert services to have rules created and deployed. And then also just some further information as far as like unit testing your rules, doing some things to kind of reduce some of the back and forth during an engagement with expert services, to reduce the number of iterations of rules that were being submitted for review. I'll take some questions there as well, and then kind of work through a demo of the implementation of a rule. So with that, the IDN Rule tool, one use case for it is for the use to create unique account attribute generation, such as an email or SAM account name. Can use these methods to help grab values from an identity within IdentityNow and generate an attribute based on those. You can use a specific set of methods to search for account attributes, such as first name, last name, basically any identity properties that are on the identity profile for an individual. You can utilize it for one source. You can use multiple sources if you want uniqueness across multiple sources. So these set of methods can be particularly useful in those endeavors. Then I have an example here where there's some collisions between AD and Azure, and we just want to make sure that we generate a proper SAM account name for that. So some of the methods of interest, like I mentioned, you can get a display name. If there's a unique identifier, you can use that method as well. First name, last name. And then if there's a particular attribute that isn't in this list, you can actually use the technical name of that attribute and retrieve it from your identity. So there's a lot of flexibility here as far as what you can use to generate attributes. And there are more methods as well. These were kind of some that we've used in some of our personal engagements. And you can find more information on Compass as far as any additional ones that may suit any of your needs. And then some methods for the actual checking of uniqueness. There is the isUnique LDAP value. This one is more probably for if you're checking something with AD, just to make sure there are no collisions on the new value that's being created. If you're, let's say, provisioning a new AD account. And then there's also the attribute search count accounts. So it counts the number of accounts with that searchable attributes you're looking for. So that one is more so maybe, outside of AD. That would be more of a useful method in that case. So the combination of those two sets of methods can assist in the generation of attributes for provisioning. When writing these rules as well, there are some variables that will need to be present within your rule. Some of these values are contained within the identity context for a bean shell rule. So you won't, like in the development process of these rules, you won't necessarily have a variable with this name, but it will be referenced within the cloud rule to operate as normal. So like the log that would be used within that rule would be the log that would be output for the IdentityNow execution. So you would not have visibility into that, but if you were to engage with expert services, they could refer to whatever was used with that log in your rule and continue from there. IDN is another context variable that will be used to point to the cell point API. The identity will be the identity in question and processing. So like if you were to create a new one or view another one in order to check for uniqueness, you would use that identity argument. And the application and field, those two are kind of in the same boat as far as those. So these, in summary, these fields are going to, like in some instances, will be present within your rule, but they'll be more so used to leverage the idea and context methods and values. As far as how to utilize it, prior to actually searching for attributes to use for generation, you need to configure those attributes for searching. And there are a few API calls that have to be executed first. You'll want to make sure you have the source ID of the sources you want to use for your comparisons. So let's say you have an AD and an Azure source. You want to get those two IDs within IDN. And then you'll create searchable attributes. So let's say you want email to be a searchable attribute. You want to make sure you can compare that you're not generating any duplicate emails. You would need to submit this post with whichever values you would like to use for your the name of your search, the display name of it, and then these two will need to be the IDs of the sources that you retrieved here. So whatever sources you're going to use for your comparison. And then you'll want to have these attributes as named within the attribute schema. And then also you can want to make sure you can verify that those attributes were created, so that'll be one less thing to worry about if you do run into issues. You'll know at least that you'll have your searchable attributes there. Once you have your searchable attributes in place, you want to actually go to the creation of the rule and then query the attributes for conflicts. So what you'll need to do is insert your code into an XML formatted document here. You'll have this in the beginning of it, and then you'll have your logic. And then, for example, here, this is going to be your list of source IDs. You also need to use within the rule to check for the comparisons. And then, your code here, as far as generating the rule, generating the email, you'll need to have a method to actually call to search for the values. Like you'll have a list here of the generated emails. And then you'll want to return the actual, the final value. So you'll return the result of your logic. You'll need to get the identity properties to submit to the call. So to submit to your logic. So for example, first name, middle name, last name. Let's say you want to create an email with that. Once you have those, you can call your rule essentially within the logic of this XML. So that's the basic structure of a rule for attribute generation. Making sure you have the searchable attributes in place as well as your logic will get you towards your check for collision. I just want to pause right here and see if there are any questions. I actually cannot hear if anyone has any questions. But if there's not, I will continue. So the rule development process, this was a kind of like standard work we've used to drive development in a process where you can actually create a rule using Eclipse, write unit tests to test that it works as you would like as far as creating the attributes when there are collision, and then also going a step further and checking the syntax to a high degree to see if it matches with Bean Shell using JMeter, and then also being able to take that back to the XML envelope that I shown previously. Right here, and then also being able to take that and run it through the sale point validator that was mentioned in the previous presentation as well. Once you've gone through that process, you have maybe a higher level of confidence that The rule that you're going to submit will be valid, will not be revisited for multiple reviews, and can deliver value a little bit quicker to your customer. Some pros to this process, some JUnit testing can help, with as far as the development process, giving you repeatable, measurable tests to make sure that you've met the specifications that the client is asking for. Use of your IDE can, you can also check your code coverage. You can say with, whatever level % of confidence that you've tested this code. You can able to pinpoint with some level of accuracy some of the syntax issues that exist between Bean Shell and Java as well. Some of the cons to this is there is some room for error. Taking the code back from your Java implementation of the rule to Bean Shell. It's not a one-to-one issue, especially as far as the newer versions of Java. There's some syntax that's just not valid in Bean Shell. And then also those IDN-specific methods and context variables, you're not able to leverage those using this process that we've detailed here. So for the process, it's the first step. Taking a test-driven implementation for this will be to write the unit tests. You have the requirements from your client. You want to try to make the rules. So you're going to say, okay, we would expect this behavior with this name, with this list of values within IDN already. So let's say we want to add a user with first name, middle name, last name here with this domain. We would just check to see what would be generated if there's no one within IDN, if there already is a Richard Miles in IDN, and then if there's also 2 collisions in IDN. So we're just writing test cases for those. So we have rule 1, rule 2. And then this is an example of one of the rules, so no collision. We just set up a test. We're going to expect to see the first name, dot, last name, and then the domain in this scenario. And then our expected value is going to be our rule. We're going to ask our rule to generate an email. And we're going to submit the values, first name, middle name, last name here, kind of simulate what IDN would do. And then just print the results and then assert that they are equal. Just making sure that what you expect is what you actually get. So in the case of no existing users with this first, middle, last name, you would expect to get just the first name and last name in this scenario. The next step would be to actually make the rule. Let me zoom in a little bit here. So for this, you need your list of test emails. This is a variable that we're going to use to insert our own emails into this rule as if it were coming from IDN. That would be done here in this test generator. So we're going to submit this list. So in our subsequent tests, we would get these lists. So like this would be our list of users in IDN at that stage of the test. So for the first one, we just do an empty list. We have a method. We have these lists of sources here. So this could, for example, be an Azure and AD source. We're going to use these 2 sources to check for unique values for proxy address as well as email. And then we'll have our logic here. We'll have a check to see if it's valid, which will consist of the search values list, which will be a call using the SMTP and then the email and then the SIP and email. We're going to check to see that for those properties that there's we're going to search those ones. And then once we call our IDN attribute search counts one of those methods of interest with these values, we'll check to see if there's an email that is contained within one of these 2 sources. Now, as I mentioned before, these IDN context variables cannot be used within these this Java context. So for this test, we're not going to check proxy address, but we're going to check the collision on email using the test list that was here previously. So we're gonna simulate the comparison using Java's contains method. So if this list contains that email. Ideally, if there's a way to mock one of these IDN context using the Identity IQ jar or something of that nature, that would be more ideal to have kind of a more accurate experience with that. But at this point, we're just going to operate under the assumption that this method would work as intended. Same with this one as well. And then these are just some methods here as far as just to check that there's not blanks, like for escape characters within the logic here. These methods just minimized. And then also, as I mentioned before, we'll need to grab those identity attributes from IDN. And then, I just threw some logging in here, and then the actual call to the rule is right here. So that's this method here. So this method will call all these subsequent sub-processes and return the value here. As you can see, some of these values are commented out. All the IDN context variables are commented out. These lists, the search list, the call for the method of interest, this one as well, and then also the different methods that are calling these names here. So what we're going to do, though, is instead of making a call here, we make the call in the JUnit test to this method and feed in these variables. So once you have that, you want to just make sure that the tests you have in place pass with a high level of code coverage. So this is a sample generator for email. This was the logic we had before. You can see in green where the code has hit these cases in its entirety. Yellow means it's hit maybe half of that case. So like, for example, here, this if condition, if is valid email. So we maybe checked that it is a true, like it is valid. Maybe we've not checked if it's not valid within this set of tests we've executed here at least. And then you can, check over here and see, with what level of confidence you've tested this rule. So for this rule, we've tested 95% of the logic that is here, excluding the commented out items. So as far as, these lists, and then those IDN methods of interest, you just have to make sure visually that they match what is in the documentation on Compass. As you can see here, you can see what's been executed within the test, the test for no collisions, maybe if there's one matching user, and then if there were two. And then you can see the results of those JUnits here. And as I mentioned before, the coverage there, and then the actual output from those tests here. And then once you have, high level confidence that your rule is behaving as you'd expect in Java, one way you can also, take a step further to make sure it works within IDN using Bean Shell is to use a tool called JMeter. Apache JMeter has a Bean Shell sampler, I guess is the term for it, where you can actually run Bean Shell code. Again, we cannot use, the IDN context variables, so you can at least make sure that the syntax here would match what was expected in IdentityNow with Bean Shell. So for the sampler here, I have that same rule, same things are commented out. There was one thing that I found as far as using the Commons line 3 library. It's needed a different value here for Bean Shell. So that was one thing that, this found that Java did not because of just the difference between the two languages. And then what you can do with that is once you have it set up properly, you can run the rule with logging enabled. And then if you would just log the result of your rule output, you can see in the logs that it either generates properly or not. The line above this one in the red box actually is that log statement that I had for logging the attributes that were passed in. And then this one is just the results of that. And then once you have, those two things, you can slip your rule back into the Bean Shell XML. You just want to make sure everything's uncommented. Make sure you take out that test list. Make sure you you have all the things you would need as far as generating that rule. So like I said before, there's those pros and cons with this approach. This is one thing that kind of we've seen in a couple of engagements help with reducing the number of iterations we needed to submit to SailPoint. And then that last step, as mentioned before too, is to run the rule validator. You just want to make sure that your rules are analyzed and that there's no errors, and you validate success. You can submit that during your review. Again, I cannot hear during the questions, so I will proceed with the demo. So I'll just show the rule for the email generation. Okay, so in here, this is the email generator as before. Let me make this a little bit bigger. So we have, those SailPoint items commented out. These, for the list, the sources for proxy address, for the mail, the logic for generating the email. You're just gonna, take your values here, check to see if both of these are not blank. In the first scenario, you want to make sure that your first name and last name are not blank, and then you can return the result of processing those three values. In here, you're gonna generate your email, so just go ahead and take a stab at it. Check if it's valid. If it's valid, return the email. If it's not valid, you're gonna step to the second portion of the rule generation, which would be to include the middle name. So we're gonna try adding a unique counter to that value, which would be using first, middle, last name, and then a unique counter. You check to see if that's valid. If you do that for 100 iterations and you don't find one, then you can just let them know, hey, you couldn't find one. And then for the process of actually generating that email, you, like I said, construct it with a unique counter, starting at 0 or blank for the first one. And then you check to see if it's valid. If it's not, check to see if you can use a middle name. And then if you can get something there, you turn that. You go back here and see if it's valid in that same process. Constructing the email, this is kind of where it's broken down to its base. You take the first name, last name, and the domain. You just take all of them and knock them to lower cases with a dot. So like first name dot last name would be the first one. Constructing with the email would be first name dot middle name dot last name, all lower. And then as we mentioned before, the unique counter is present there, starting with a blank. And then once you get to the past that first iteration of them, it'll start adding actual digits like 1 through 100. All right, I guess in this case 99 through, since it's less than 100. So we also have that check for if it's a valid email. So you just check to see if there's no collisions on proxy address and no collisions on email. As I mentioned before, proxy address, we just kind of simulated that one just to simplify the test to just return true. So we're going to mainly check and see if there's collision on the email. If there's no collision on both, we'll say it is a valid email. If there's collision on one or the other, then it is false. So these are the two collision checks that we'll be using, the IDN methods of interest, the account search here and here. You have your list of search values, which would be for email here. And then for here, you use email as far as looking within the proxy address, within email, and then here within proxy address, because these would be the values that would be in the proxy address for that. And then also, like I mentioned before, this is just that is not blank check I have here. There is a method within newer versions of Java that has that. However, Bean Shell does not. So I just threw that in there so I could use that to simplify the process here. Again, here you have those IDN versus to grab the identity attributes, that logging statement, and then the actual call to the rule. So if we were to run these tests, we have these tests here. We would test for no collision. So you'd expect that if you use these values with an empty user base, you would just get the first name dot last name at the domain. If there is an existing user, you would expect to get the first name dot middle name dot last name for this test 1A. For this test 2A, let's say the scenario they don't have a middle name. Let's say it's just Richard Miles. Then you would expect there to be, instead of going to Richard James Miles, you expect Richard Miles 1. And then for 2B, just making sure that case follows as well with no middle name. So we go from this to 1 or to 2. So I have those rules detailed here. Expected values, for this one. So the first expected one here is just first name. Expand this one. So it's be first name dot last name at domain. Next one will be first name dot middle name dot last name at domain. And then this one will be first name dot last name and then the unique counter at domain. And then also making sure that occurs here for this one. And then, as like I mentioned before, there's these kind of helper methods here, just setting up the email generator and setting that test list to these lists we've defined up here. And then just printing those results in the console down here so we can see them clearly. So if I were to run this test email generator, we'll see for the result here, we expected this first name dot last name, and that's what we actually got. And then same with this one, we got first, middle, last, and then this is the first, last with the unique counter and situation where there's still first, middle, and last, but that's already been used. We revert back to just using first, last with the unique counter. And then in the case where there's no middle name, we make sure that we have the first name, last name, unique counter. So those tests passed successful. We have our rule here as we believe to be expected properly. So we take this rule to the bean shell sampler, copy and paste it here. You want to comment out the package. Just a few things in Java need to be commented out. So this package here, as I mentioned here, this kind of turned up as an issue with this library in particular. You might encounter them as you try to run. It'll tell you in the log as far as what would be an issue. Those IDN context variables, you want to comment out the class name because, a bean shell, at least for this rule, the way it was structured, does not utilize a class. That email list also you'll want to either delete or comment out. Those IDN context properties as well you want to comment out. So those will match kind of what was in the class that I detailed earlier. So one thing to note here is with those identity attributes that we counted out here, to run the test, you want to actually just plug in some values and see that it works. There could be anything that fit your test case. The idea here is not to test cases, but just to test that the rule functions properly. So you'll have your call to generate the email, and then instead of returning the values, you can throw a log statement here just to make sure that you can see what's being returned, since you won't be able to see it in the log. So if we have this stuff here and we try to run this, you'll see that we get this result back for the first name dot last name with no users, just that initial base test case. And then you can have some level of certainty that your code is working. Now, an example, let me actually do this.
Hey, Julian, sorry to interrupt. Hey, Julian, sorry to interrupt. We might need to move on to our next presenter. So maybe, we just wrap up soon.
So if you were to run this here, you would see that there's an error invoking the bash inline evaluation here. The string util, so it gives you some indications here. There's some more documentation online as far as this Apache JMeter. This is kind of just the high-level surface of utilizing it. I'm sure you can get into more detail and more information as far as utilizing this, maybe even without some of this stuff being commented out or used in this way. But once you have that, you can also take that rule back to your XML, as mentioned before. Make sure everything is either removed or uncommented as necessary. and then you'll want to run it through that rule validation script here. So you want to run the commands like java-jar /rule validator, and then you just want to put the path. If you're going to use like within a folder, just the file, you can evaluate all the rules within that path, all the folders and all the files in that folder. So I just have it at this path here, and if you execute that, you'll see one rule is analyzed, and this folder only have one in there, and it just process as a success. So once you have that, you have like I said, a level of confidence that your rule should pass. There may still be issues, but at least you've done your due diligence to make sure that a lot of these issues have been addressed beforehand. So with that, that concludes my presentation. These are some of the SailPoint Compass community links to the sources I used here. I'm not sure if this presentation will be available to distribute, but if you like these links, that'll be something there. And if there's any other processes that anyone else has as far as developing rules, I'd like to compare notes, see ways to improve this, or even find ways that haven't been thought about. So I just want to say thank you again for attending this presentation, and I hope that this information is valuable to you.